time has gone into this. Our incredible panelists from the American Society of Golf Course Architects and the tireless planning and organizing of Jason Otzlis of the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site. Thanks to you all. As with most of our programs that we've offered this year, we're really looking at Olmsted's legacy and how it influenced history, but also what it does for us going forward. And I know most of our panelists have been thinking about Olmsted and golf for quite some time, but sort of the nice coincidence of Olmsted's bicentennial year and the US Open happening both in Brookline seemed like the perfect time to bring this group of panelists together. And so today we'll hear about a discussion of Olmsted's principles and how they've influenced course design and shaped the profession of golf course architecture. So first I'm going to introduce Alan Banks, who's a longtime friend and employee of the site. He's going to give a brief overview of Olmsted. Alan worked for the Olmsted National Historic Site and has been studying Olmsted for over 30 years. Even in retirement, he continues to study and is keenly interested in researching where the intersections of Olmsted life and work have happened. One of those is sort of his happy coincidence of moving to Brookline to plan for the Emerald Necklace and Franklin Park, which is where we are today. So he's going to speak briefly on how the game of golf has influenced the use of Olmsted parks, including this one, where the second public golf course in the country was established in 1896. So I'm going to turn it over to Alan. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. And I guess I'm going to stand down here just for this. I think after this I'm going to go back and we're just going to have some fun talking. But again, my name's Alan Banks, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of background in terms of what is the connection of Frederick Olmsted to golf. And sometimes that connection was incidental. Sometimes it was that his firm actually worked, usually not on the golf courses themselves, but oftentimes at places like Augusta National, where they worked with Bobby Jones and Alistair McKenzie and the grounds around the clubhouse. Baltusrol in New Jersey is another club that they worked on. So they did have that formal connection, but a lot of the connection between Olmsted Senior and golf, again, was more incidental. I think most people, when they hear the name Olmsted, usually associate it with the great public parks that he designed. And we don't like to believe it here in Boston, but they usually do think of that park down in Manhattan, Central Park. And if you're familiar with Olmsted's design work, you realize that was his very first project. He worked on it with his first partner, Calvert Vaux. But not only was it one of the very first, if not the first, large urban park in this country, it's also considered to be, in some ways, the founding of the profession of landscape architecture, which the people behind me are carrying on in a very specific way. To look at public parks and why they were built, there's really three major roles that Olmsted felt that a park could play. One was as a real physical relief for people who were living in cities. They were starting to correlate, especially physicians, open space, fresh air, sunshine with people's health. In fact, if you came in through the entrance at Forest Hills, you saw the Lemuel Shattuck Hospital. He was a person who was very active in the what they call sanitation movement of trying to clean up cities. So when parks were being built, their early proponents were initially doctors. And after these parks were built, doctors would literally prescribe for their patients, you should go to the park, 2 hours for the next 2 weeks, and that's going to cure what ails you. So there was that physical part of it. The second part was a psychological part of how parks like Franklin Park or Central Park or Prospect Park in Brooklyn could also help relieve some of the stress of city living. And a lot of people are going to know this quote. It's one of my favorite of Olmsted's. That he said that the chief end of a large park is an effect on the human organism, which, like that of music, goes back to thought and cannot be fully given the form of words. So besides that physical health, the idea was that you were passing through the scenery that he was designing, you would actually relax and kind of de-stress. There's a term, in Japan, there's something called forest bathing, which is very similar. The idea is going into nature will kind of clean you out in many different ways, physically and psychologically. And then the last kind of component was not just the health of the individual, but of the community itself. Parks were a place that would bring people from all walks of life together. And when he visited Central Park, about a decade after he and his partner designed it, he said, "Where else in the year of our Lord, 1870, we thus see vast numbers of people brought together, each person adding to the pleasure of all others, just by their mere presence. And he talked about who he saw there, young and old, rich and poor, and Jew and Gentile. So the original thought behind a park like Franklin Park, again, was to have this multiple curative effect for cities. Now, the style that he chose was a style that's often described as the English Romantic style. If you've ever visited England and visited a place like Blenheim, where Winston Churchill was born, designed back in the 18th century, you know the type of landscape you find there is like large open meadows. If you look out the window, actually, you can sort of see what you would see there. Again, large rolling meadows, lots of openness. This was very important to Olmsted, so that people who were living in these crowded cities would be able to gaze across the pasture land. He described the beauty of it as the beauty of the prairie, of the open field. Here's where the problem comes in. What is one person's open field is, of course, somebody else's fairway. So almost while Franklin Park here was being built, you saw people beginning to use it for golf. The story goes that George Wright, who owned a sporting goods store, ended up getting a set of golf clubs sent to him from England instead of badminton set. So what he decided to do was come to Franklin Park and try to get in a little bit of golf. He didn't really know what he was doing, but he did, again, first introduce golf here kind of on an ad hoc basis. A short time later, Willie Campbell, who was actually the pro at the Brookline Country Club, left that position because he was a Scotsman. And for Scotsmen, the idea of public golf was extremely important, that the community should be golfing. So he actually came here with his wife, Georgiana, and they both were golf pros here in Franklin Park. This is 1896. And a little bit of trivia, a lot of people consider his wife to be the first professional woman golfer in the country because she was charging for golf lessons here in Franklin Park. The problem is that sometimes golf and parks don't mix. And I'm just going to give you a short quote from Olmsted's son, John Charles Olmsted, who was also a landscape architect and actually worked on the design for Franklin Park with his dad. In 1905, this is 10 years after his dad retired. In fact, his dad had passed away a couple of years before. He talked about changes in Franklin Park. And he said of the Franklin Park, he said, the introduction of golf playing is an unrealized sacrifice of the pleasure and comfort of many in the enjoyment of the park. Not only are the attractive and harmless sheep driven out, what is worse, the nerves of the visitor are further irritated by the anxiety by being hit by the hard and swiftly driven balls. But to understand, again, there was a shift at this point in time where active recreation was becoming much more popular. I mean, I think the National League, for example, in baseball, I think 1874. The USGA, 1894. So there was a lot of people seeking out space to use for these more what Olmsted called gregarious activities. But the funny thing is the people who were promoting things like golf in the park were really giving the same reasons that Olmsted was giving for why a park was important. It was said that, again, playing golf, and I'll give you a quote. It says, golf has the merit of being a real cure under real physiological conditions. The man of 70 looks 50, and the man of 50 has the appearance of 35. The golf swing is also a great cure for the sluggish liver. And there was also the psychological part again. They talked about women, that it was so important for women to be able to get out and recreate in these large open spaces, and it was said that no other special achievement on behalf of women is so important and so far-reaching in its results, with a single exception of the improvement of legal status of women than the sport revolution, which has meant so much more psychologically than it has physically. So again, playing golf here, it was the same thing Olmsted was talking about. Again, this was not the original use of the park, but a lot of Olmsted parks today have golf courses in them. So again, the connection there is a little bit more incidental, but when you have a chance later on, you'll see in the back of the room, some images from the collection that we have at the Olmsted site, and get a sense for some of the type of work that they did. I think I'm losing my voice now, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I guess we'll start.
So, hi everyone, my name is Strawn. I'm really delighted to see all of you here today. this has really been an exciting morning for us because we all got to go visit the archives. I think for each of us, it was the first time being able to do that, and it's just such a wonderful place to be and inspiring. So the chance to talk about Olmsted's influence on the profession of golf course architecture and on each of our individual careers as golf course architects is really quite exciting. So we want this just to be conversational, and I hope we can make it enjoyable for all of you. So thanks again for coming out. So I want to start just by asking everyone, first, I think I know more or less the answer to this question, but when did you first get interested in being a golf course architect? When did you sort of discover what it really means to be a golf course architect? And then second, as a corollary to that question, when were you first introduced to Frederick and Olmsted? So I'll start. Jason Straka is currently the president of the American Society of Golf Course Architects, so we'll start at the top.
I got interested yesterday. John, and first off, thanks for joining all of us today. It's a pleasure to be back in the area. Boston in general has a special meaning for me, which I'll describe it a little bit. I grew up in Ohio, and I love the outdoors. I was attracted to conservationism, preservationism, people like John Muir. I started to investigate landscape architecture, and I ended up at Cornell University, which was a campus was designed by F.L. Olmsted, right by Olmsted. So that made a lot of immediate connection there. As I started to learn more, I mean, virtually everybody in this room has some impact and some experience with an Olmsted Park, city. I mean, there's so many different things, and for me, my grandparents are immigrants. They came from Italy. They settled down in a town called Vandergrift, Pennsylvania. Yeah, and so which was designed by Olmsted for immigrants, to work around the mills there. They ended up, they moved to Youngstown, Ohio, which I found out today. They actually manufactured some of the equipment for the Olmsted office of interest. And then went to work for Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which I found today. The whole facility was designed by Olmsted. So it's amazing in that regard, all these personal connections that you end up finding. And then when I was at Cornell, of course, my background is I studied landscape architecture, and you got a thorough indoctrination into Olmsted, design, and you study American design, European design, and of course then interesting names, in European and English garden design, it was Capability Brown, right? So we talked a little bit about him today. And so, again, we made field trips to Boston here when I was in university, 30 some odd years ago, and it's great to be back. But that was really my draw. My background became environmental golf course design, John, as you know. For those of you who've ever been down to Widow's Walk, and anybody been down to Scituate before in Widow's Walk, that was actually my master's thesis in college, and that was the first environmental demonstration golf course designed and built in North America. And so many, many moons ago, and we did all this university research at Widow's Walk, and it still happens today. So that was my first introduction to F.L. Olmsted.
Great. So Bel Jan is another former president now of the American Society of Golf Course Architects. So Jan, what about your inspiration to become a golf course architect, which I know is very personal for you, and also your connection to Olmsted?
Thank you, John, and I appreciate being here with this group. I mean, it's terrific. My story starts with my father and his 5 brothers. They were all caddies. They were all caddies during the Depression. They helped fund the family coffers. They all were 5 of the 6 brothers went to World War II all at the same time, and the 6th one made it to the Korean War. All came back safely, thank you very much. One had PTSD, which we call that now. They called it shell shock then. When they came back from the war, they all went to what they knew best. That was golf. So my father was a golf pro superintendent who designed and supervised the construction of the golf course where I grew up, 35 miles east of Pittsburgh. What attracted me to the game was not just that my father played the game. We had the driving range literally in our backyard. We lived on 435 acres of country club property with 3 square miles of government-owned flood control land around it, 3 miles from the closest town. Our closest neighbors were a quarter-mile away, quite rural. So I tell you that because it's very similar to the kind of background that Frederick Law Olmsted had, albeit 100 years later or more. Very rural and appreciative of what rural life was and rural scenery. So when I was a little tyke, when the golf course was under construction, there's nothing more fascinating to almost everyone than seeing big equipment work, right? So when I was this small and seeing pans and bulldozers operating, it was really pretty impressive because they built a 23-acre lake, built a dam to build a 23-acre lake on the property. So this was a golf club meant to be for weekend homes, and my dad understood from having been a caddy that it was important to design a golf course for everyone, men and women both. It wasn't just for men, because if you didn't have participation by both men and women and have juniors as well, that you wouldn't be looking after all the people who could play golf and who could support you. So I learned about golf from him, but then I also learned that the only way I could graphically depict my ideas about golf courses was to study landscape architecture. So I'm a landscape architecture student, and I decided on that so that I could do more with golf. And that's my story.
Thanks. And just as a personal, I met Jan in 1988 when we were both students at the Harvard Graduate School of Design seminar in golf course architecture, taught by Robert Miragraves and a person who many of you may know, Jeff Cornish, who passed away a few years ago, excuse me, who was really a wonderful person. So I think it was a 3 or 4 day seminar.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't claim to have a degree from Harvard, but I do have a little certificate hanging on my wall back home in Portland. But here is somebody who actually does have a genuine degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So Brandon Johnson, can you tell us a little bit about your own background in learning, wanting to become a golf course architect and your connection to Olmsted?
Yeah, well, one, thank you for the opportunity to come back to a place that I spent 2 years, up the road studying. My start into golf course architecture started with golf, and I'm a professed golf nut. My best friend growing up asked me one day, hey, do you want to go play golf? I said, sure. We went to the local 9-hole golf course, paid our $3, and dribbled the ball down on some hard pan fairways. And I remember sitting on hole 9 and said, I hadn't whiffed the whole time. And whiffed. And I was instantly hooked and went into the clubhouse. And the pro goes, well, what are you going to do now? I said, I don't know. Just go around again. And so we played and played. And the next day, went back and played, and then we had to figure out how to fund this golf habit. So the two of us started a yard maintenance service, and so I was 12 at the time, and so I figured out, if I could get a whole bunch of yards, or about 30 minutes to do, an hour to do, I could get enough money and go play golf. And so I, had these big dreams of being a professional golfer and missed that by a long shot. But in this kind of pursuit of the game and pursuit to get better, and the old VCR of stopping, somebody's swing on TV, I noticed the golf course architecture behind it, and it ended up being Pete Dye's work, either at Harbortown or Sawgrass. And so that was really interesting to me. And my parents got me a book, Golf Courses of the PGA Tour, and I would look at the book and I would draw out of the book. And then, of course, I'd be in class. I'd be doing drawings and not concentrating on English or anything else, but dreaming about golf. And so I blindly went into the field of landscape architecture to do golf course design. And I went to North Carolina State University and was quickly a student of design. And I love art, love architecture, love the outdoors. And now I was wrestling really internally. I've always wanted to do golf course architecture, but I love urban planning. I love small scale space making. And I actually spent a lot of time in Europe traveling to all of these gardens, Stowe and Stourhead and Villante and Versailles, and going to Spain and looking at plazas. But the love of golf, that passion won out, and I was able to get an internship at the PGA Tour, and they couldn't get rid of me, and I came back for another one and helped them build TPC Deer Run, and then was hired on full time.
And Brandon is with Arnold Palmer Design now, so I think you're the only one who's working under somebody else's name.
Yes, yes, yeah.
But a pretty good name in the golf, in the golf world, I would say. So, Rich, what about your experience then? What inspired you to want to be a golf course architect?
Well, the game of golf, of course, just like everyone else. We all loved golf at an early age, and that was our plan. So since I was 15 years old, my plan was to be a golf course architect. I grew up in Westchester County, New York, in a town called Rye. And unlike Brandon, who paid for golf first, my friends and I snuck onto Rye Golf Club in 8th grade. We'd walk up the hill off Chamberlain Avenue and arrive on the 5th tee at Rye Golf Club, and we'd play 5, 6, 7, 2, 3, 4, and get out of Dodge, hopefully not getting caught. In the meantime, the 8th and 9th holes we had to skip because they were under construction and they were being redone by Reese Jones at the time. So that sort of piqued my interest early on, and I went legit the next year and got a junior membership, but the goal was always to be a golf course architect. From the early days of the golf courses of Westchester County, New York, I just fell in love with. And very similar to the golf courses here, we could see rock outcroppings right outside these windows, and that's just something, to me, it's the genius of the place, as Olmsted would say, about a lot of the golf courses in the Northeast, and fell in love. And decided I was going to go to the University of Georgia, got a degree in landscape architecture. And then I worked for a guy named Dan Maples in Pinehurst, North Carolina, whose village plan was actually designed by the Olmsted brothers, not Frederick Olmsted, but his legacy, his firm. It was in June of 1895 when they were hired, and he was sort of on his way out at that point and never made it to Pinehurst. But I worked for Dan and then worked for another golf architect, both former presidents of the ASGCA, a guy named Dennis Griffiths. And then started my own company in the early 90s with 3 civil engineers out of Easton, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. And eventually bought them all out and started my own company back in April of 2000 called Richard Mandell Golf Architecture, and moved back to Pinehurst. So I was first introduced to Frederick Olmsted. Well, I guess, we met in a bar in Cleveland, I think it was, years ago. No, I'm just kidding. But like everyone else, right, we're all landscape architecture students, and we learned about Frederick Olmsted in the academic setting, as we should. And his principles, the father of landscape architecture, and landscape architecture, we're all landscape architects. I don't think any of us are civil engineers necessarily up here. I'm sure I've got at least 3, maybe 4 or 5 others up here that would say landscape architecture is probably the best route to go if you want to be a golf course architect. And all the principles that Frederick Olmsted talks about apply in golf course architecture. So whereas he may not have ever designed a golf course, but all the things he put in place early on are principles that we all follow today.
Yeah. But it's interesting that all of you are, say, you love golf, and there are millions of golfers, who could say that. But there are really a tiny number of golf course architects designing golf courses in the world. I don't know what the current number is, but it's well below 1,000 worldwide. I mean, it's really a tiny profession. And so, and I'm sure we've all had this. I'm sitting on an airplane. God forbid there's so many miles on the airplanes for everybody. And somebody would ask, what do you do in normal exchange? And if I say, well, design golf courses, there's one of 2 reactions. It's either, that's the greatest thing in the world, I wish I could do that, or it's like I just told them I sell drugs to children. It's somewhere, that's kind of discovered. But in fact, becoming a golf course architect, I know you guys have all made it seem like it was just, I really loved golf and I wanted to do it and bingo, but it's a little more complicated than that, isn't it? How do you become get a job with one? So
I had a lot of help with that too. But, what's interesting though is I remember talking with you, Jan, after I had graduated from Harvard, and the industry was, I guess, booming at the time. And you even said, there are a lot of projects going on, but there are not that many golf course architects. And when you start to divvy them up, there's still not a lot of work out there. She was almost like, do you really want to do this? Well, yes. What is this, 23 years later? It's an honor to be on the stage with you, but it's not an easy path. And I can say that, there were more no's and more closed doors and more paths that you thought would not lead to what your dream was than the one that you actually took.
And that was the point. The point was not to discourage, but just so that you would understand the reality of it, and it's still the reality. So people who think they can be a golf course architect, and I just want you to know that almost everybody who plays golf is a golf course architect, right? So,
Or a golf course critic.
or a golf course critic, that's correct, yeah. But yeah, you're correct. And the advice I think I offered was landscape architecture, civil engineer, go to work on a golf course, go to work on construction, and that still holds true. So because of where I grew up, I started working on a golf course when I was 14. So I was mowing greens, tees, fairways, digging ditches, raking bunkers, obviously weekends and summers. But that was in the mornings. In the afternoons, I worked the golf shop. So I was doing the retail merchandising and running the tournaments and taking care of the golf carts and doing the handicaps, because this was pre-computer. So once a week, I had to collect all the scorecards, and I hand-computed all the handicaps. And my father had me do that because he was the pro superintendent, and he did that for a reason, because he played golf with a lot of the members, and he didn't ever want them to think that he was fooling with the handicaps so that he could win. So he said, if anybody ever comes here and asks you about their handicap, you do the math for them, and they'll never ask you again. And he was right. I did the math for a couple people. Here's the scorecards, here how it works. And the word got out that this is how it's done, and they were welcome to come check any time. But it does tell you that the world is still the same. Golf, as much as it's changed, is still very much the same, and I think that's important to know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that all of you made this decision about what you wanted to do when you were young, for the most part. Frederick Olmsted didn't make that decision. As I'm sure all of you know, Olmsted had a very checkered path towards creating a profession of landscape architecture. He'd failed in school, he'd failed as a farmer, some success, but then he was a writer, which I feel a great bond to him in that regard. And then finally he gets this opportunity to sort of combine all of his interests at Central Park. But now, what's interesting, Central Park, of course, there was a lot of restoration. I mean, it wasn't a pristine site by any stretch. And a lot of times, golf course architects, we have to confront the fact that people think we're somehow invading wilderness or something to build golf courses. But it's more common to do work on a degraded site. So I'm just curious, like when you're working on a degraded site, what sort of the Olmstedian principles come to the fore for you when you're thinking about how to turn a landfill or a quarry into a golf course?
Well, I can speak to Scituate. I mean, a few folks here have been down to Scituate. That was one of the worst degraded sites I'd ever seen in my life. It was sand and gravel. A lot of it went to Logan Airport to build the runways. So it was partly mined. Part of it was a landfill, and of course, then you were right there up against the estuary. So you had a very critical habitat that had been beaten and trodden upon. And so there was this opportunity to go back in and do restoration work there. So it was enriching the soils so that trees could then properly grow, native grasses could grow, and the construction of the golf course was a catalyst for all of that. Without it, without that golf, so John, you mentioned that you get on a plane and some people sort of look at you cross-eyed, but the reality is that without that golf course within that community, that site likely would have been still, we found refrigerators and people used to go dirt biking on it, and it would still be in that particular condition. Now it's protected, the water is filtered, and it's much more of a community asset, both from an environmental and a social and an economic standpoint.
What's interesting about Central Park actually is that it was really a wholly manufactured park. It was a degraded site of swampland. It wasn't able to be developed, and that's why the city commissioners originally picked the area for Central Park in the competition. And so we think of Olmsted as a landscape architect, father of landscape architecture, but he really had an engineer's mind and had to engineer the draining of the swamps and the creation of the big reservoir and other water features and how to get water from the one side of Manhattan to the site and then off the site and things like that. So for me, you know, we don't really work on degraded sites like that necessarily. Our challenge is to deal with what the site brings. And Olmsted's course as a landscape architect, of course, he did Central Park early on in his career, and then went on to be a farmer and a journalist and all these other things, and working with the Union troops in the SSC and things like that, and then came full circle back to landscape architecture to do Prospect Park, and then eventually got up here to the Emerald Necklace and all. And he sort of was evolved into someone who talks about the genius of the place, genius loci, and what makes each site special. And so for me as a golf course architect, I try to figure out what makes each site special. And there are some sites that there's just nothing special about them. You know, they're dead flat sites. I have a project in St. Petersburg, Florida right now that it's an existing golf course from the 70s, but it's dead flat. It runs underneath a major highway 3 different times. It has condominiums on both sides of almost every fairway. There's not much there to do. So that's the real challenge in landscape architecture. I mean, if we had a sand valley or a stream song or abandoned dunes, that's easy. It's taking a flat piece of property in St. Petersburg, Florida, or anywhere in Florida, and Jan and Brandon can certainly talk about that. How do you bring out the site more and create something that's special, that's never been seen anywhere else? And so his principles that he evolved long after his initial foray to Central Park sort of speak to that for me in golf architecture.
Yeah, and like Rich, I mean, I haven't worked on a bunch of degraded sites. I can have an appreciation for what Olmsted was able to do politically. I think before I worked with the Arnold Design Company, I was the head golf course architect at the first tee, which for me, you know, having to pay to play golf and having access issues, and I did steal my way onto Carmel Country Club every now and then, but don't tell anybody. But you know, I felt a real calling to try and grow the game responsibly and have people have access and have the ability to enjoy the game the way that I did. And the first tee at the time was very facility driven. And so, you know, I had this bright idea. It was one of the things that I did in graduate school was study golf courses on landfills. And, you know, that'd be a perfect use for a golf course. And it was very difficult to do. There were several properties that we looked at around the country, plans, but the bureaucracy, the permitting, the political approvals in my 7 years at the company was just, it was an impossibility. So later on in my career, I've worked more on sites, like you said, that were featureless. I mean, I can think of the project that we completed in Florida. It was 800 acres and it was as flat as this floor. And you have the requirement, though, to drain this piece of property. And you know, one of the requirements of cutting is that, you know, all of a sudden there's going to be water, but you can only fill. And there's, 10 trees on the site that you're clamoring to, trying to hold on to. So the idea of building something that's fun, building something that's also believable within this landscape was what I was thinking of on that project. And, you know, it's not easy to do, especially when you only have, you know, you can only go up and you can't go down. And so when you do look at believable landscapes, I mean, there is a true flow to it. And I think, you know, Olmsted was this master of masking his work. Like you said, Central Park was completely manufactured, and everyone now looks at that mature piece of property and thinks that's nature. No, that was completely contrived, just within the aesthetic of, you know, the picturesque or the beautiful.
You know, it's interesting, the Golden Age architects would, you know, most of the people on this panel would look back, they would be a sort of profound sense of jealousy, because the understanding is that what really distinguished them was they got to go pick the site, so they wouldn't even presume to put a golf course on it. This is the assumption. It's not really true. Tillinghast used a lot of dynamite, you know, but all of those famous names of the golden era that you would know, Tillinghast and Alistair Mackenzie and George Thomas and Donald, they were not landscape architects. In fact, some of them were really quite amateur golfers, although pretty good amateurs. George Crump, who built Pine Valley. They knew so little at the time. I mean, they imported a lot of clay to Pine Valley to try to give some body to the site. Now, you know, nowadays golf course architects would know to die for a site that's only sand, but they didn't think that that was going to work, even though they ended up still with the greatest golf course in the world, perhaps. But so I'm just curious. It's not until after World War II that the American Society of Golf Course Architects is formed or founded. So prior to that, there weren't a lot of landscape architects working in golf design, as far as I know. I mean, Robert Trent Jones did his own little mini curriculum at Cornell, but he didn't get a degree. He was a special student. So I'm just curious, you know, when, you know, how you see the training in landscape architecture and the pulling in of the Olmsted principles into the profession.
Well, I mean, as far as the principles that Olmsted used for design, I mean, we use those on a daily basis. You know, today when we were out and we were getting our personal tour of the site there, you know, we talked about walking through the rock area, right? The little paths, and you're creating this sense of arrival and space. And, you know, that's what the best golf courses are, you know, John. I mean, you're leading people through an 18-hole journey, right, is what's happening. And so many times, you know, you don't want to, for example, just have everything put out in front of you. You want to create some sense of maybe anxiety, anticipation. And you're building this whole journey all the way through from the very beginning at the clubhouse and even before that. You know, so I mean, as golf course architects, we think, you know, very much holistically. You know, so for me, I get excited. I'm going to be playing in my member guest this weekend. I couldn't be more excited. I mean, I have awesome tickets to the U.S. Open tomorrow. I can't wait to get home to play golf, right? I mean, so that's maybe a little counterintuitive to most folks. But there's this, you know, so already I'm thinking about when you're arriving to the clubhouse and, you know, getting into the clubhouse and that progression to the practice range, maybe to the 19th hole for an early start, right? I mean, so there's all these things that are happening before you even get to the first tee. And then as you're going through that golf course and, you know, experiencing that particular site, whether it's built, like Brandon and Rich are saying, or whether it's discovered, you know, maybe like abandoned dunes, you know, either way. And then when you finish, you know, then you want people to come back and enjoy that experience again. And so you're again, it becomes that after you finish, then what? You know, they get back to the clubhouse and you're coming here, you know, and do you have this sense of community and bonding? Those are all things, you know, that we all learned through landscape architecture and Frederick Law Olmsted.
And I think for us as golf course architects, the routing is so important, whether it's on a manufactured site or a choice piece of property. You know, we went to Sand Hills and saw that, and I think the golf course architect's interpretation of that site and what those attributes are, and sometimes it's not what they do, but it's what they leave out. Or what they choose to use and don't choose to use. It's just as important, maybe even more important than what you do. You know, the site at Sand Hills or abandoned dunes, I mean,
Right.
When you have this pristine landscape out there, I mean, you don't want to destroy it. I mean, you talk about this journey and the emotions, and, you know, I'm also a musician, so you were bringing up the Olmsted quote about music, and he talked about that, he wants people to be emotional about the work that he's doing, and music and landscape are probably the two things that move people emotionally the same way. And, you know, as an architect, you're looking at a site like that, it's like, ooh, I want to go there. But if I go there, I'm going to destroy that. And, you know, how can I leave that and let everyone experience it without destroying what is great about the site? And then complementing the site with whatever you do with the design. You know, making choices to be bold or making choices to be really, really subtle. And like, no one is ever going to know that you actually did something there. Or you do a whole bunch of stuff and people think you did nothing. So I mean, it's all of these little choices that you have to make.
So I'll capitalize on some of the comments I've heard here from Jason, Brandon, and Rich. I worked with Tom Fazio before I started my own firm. And among the golf courses that probably received the most notoriety was one called Black Diamond. Anybody here see that play out? 1986, 86 is when it was opened, but that was designed, and we had to be very thoughtful about creating the spaces there. There were two quarries. One was a wet quarry that had wall faces 86 feet high, and then 86 feet deep water below that. And then there was a dry quarry. Where do these go? I mean, this was absolutely degraded land. It was phosphate mine. And we were able to do, and I took the photographs. I was on the property and actually stood on the tee locations where they ended up being to play a par 4, par 5, par 4, and 2 par 3s. So when you talk about this creating sense of space and making the most of whatever you're given, this was certainly it. Where do you put the clubhouse and still have these 5 golf holes? Where do they belong in the routing? And so it very much is like music. Where's the crescendo? In this case, they ended up being on the back 9, holes 13 through 17, and then people kind of felt, well, you've gone through all this drama because the space was huge from this side of the quarry to that side of the quarry. It was, the openness, the massive openness was terrific. And then you go back into closed spaces. You came from closed spaces to open spaces, and how people felt playing there was remarkable. And it's what made that golf course special. To then talk about, you mentioned Stream Song, Rich, and that too, there's 3 courses there now, about to have another, that were, again, on phosphate. But they moved dirt on this whole phosphate area completely differently than what Black Diamond had been. So Black Diamond in 1987, I think, was best new golf course, you know, when there were a lot of golf courses under construction. And it still is prominent today, but once that was done, it was amazing to see how many other people designed around quarries and into the quarries, the same as had been done at that property. But you know, and it's also interesting because Stream Song being what it is, all phosphate, a limited number of plant materials can grow on that soil. It's very alkaline. So unfortunately, the 2 that do the best are highly invasive species. One is called Kogan grass, and the other one's called Brazilian pepper. And those are the 2 features that you would find not on the property, or I mean on the property other than turf. So it's really important to, you know, as landscape architects, golf course architects, we're aware not just of what we're designing for play, for strategy, for aesthetics, but also for the environment.
Yeah, I'm just curious, is there ever a conflict, or do you have to reconcile, on the one hand, trying to find the genius of the place, and on the other hand, the formal requirements of a golf course? Because you have to have 18 sets of tees, you have to have 18 greens, ideally, or a couple of routes going back and forth to the clubhouse. So, I mean, how do you reconcile and deal with those formal requirements?
You're asking me specifically, huh?
I'll cover it for you. I mean, you know, everything we talked about, one element of our career, of our profession we haven't talked about is we're designing for a game, right?
That's right.
Sport. Yeah. And so there are requirements, like depending on how much land you have, a certain number of tees and tee boxes and greens and fairways and things like that. So, you know, it's not, for me, it's not hard to reconcile that. That's the challenge, is find the genius of the place. And the only reason we're there is for golf. You know, encompassing it, it's golf. There are other elements, but golf is why we're there. And so that's what golf architecture is how do we place 18 tee boxes? How do we string 18 golf holes together in the golf course routing process and create something that is unique to that piece of property, and how that piece of property is unique to every other piece of property in the world. So I don't like to move a lot of dirt myself. Sometimes we have to, but for the most part, even a small rock outcropping like the one I'm looking at right now out there, you know, that would be a major feature to me that I would try to work around, because that rock outcropping there only exists in one place exactly like that in the world, and that's right out there. There are variations. There might be one behind me, but that's just a little different. Every feature is unique to itself. And so the more of those features you can incorporate into the game, the better the product is. So that's what we're always focusing on and what makes golf great is not just the fact that you could tell yourself, hey, I haven't whiffed yet, and then I'm going to whiff, the mental side of that, but the strategic side of that. And what great golf architecture is is a piece of property, and every golf hole is designed based on that piece of property, and the strategy of that golf hole is based on that piece of property. And so, for instance, if we take that rock outcropping out there, and we were to, obviously we've got parking lot and clubhouse here, but if we had a rock outcropping in the middle of a fairway, that becomes a hazard. And the challenge is, how do we get from point A to point B over that rock outcropping? And that's a golf hole right there. So it's very easy to reconcile that in my mind.
And John, I find one thing, and I think that's very accurate statements. It's ironic, though, that we're sitting here doing this in New England. What I find is that, of course, when the golf courses were being originally built in this area, primarily by Scotsmen, that, keep in mind, for those of you who've ever traveled over to Ireland, Scotland, in the countries there where golf was originally from, is that they had, 18 holes. Everybody thinks that 18 holes is what, that is the gold standard now, but golf courses there were 12 holes, 15 holes, 22 holes, right? And so it wasn't until St. Andrews that it became sort of codified, and even that wasn't 18 holes originally. And so, here, I find it refreshing. You can go down the road to Wannamoyset, and it's a par 69, or, a golf course might be 5,800 yards here. And you have all these, what we think is, oddities, elsewhere, but it's just normal here in New England. And so I think that, unfortunately, we get handcuffed a little bit, and we have to do our best sales job. So when we go out and we're building the game, right, in these other places, then we're seeming to having to force ourselves to conform more, whereas it was a little different here, and certainly different overseas.
Yeah, and I
Do
think,
you not think that was because some of that's been promoted since golf became televised? Because prior to television, it didn't matter what the yardage was. You played the yardage. And so once television came and people heard par 72 and they heard this length, and of course they're watching the best players. And I say this because I remember listening to my dad and my uncles, and as a 6, 7-year-old kid listening to adults be so enthusiastic about a game, about anything. And I like this hole, and I played well here, and that person did this, and this is how this person sucked this putt or chipped in on these holes that were so different than what you might expect today. And I think maybe there was more of a formalization as people started seeing more once golf was on TV.
Well, the irony of that is you're right about TV, but we were talking, you had mentioned how landscape architecture golf course architects became landscape architects became golf course architects more after the golden age in the 40s and 50s, and that coincided with television on TV, but also the advent of the PGA Tour.
Right.
And so people would watch the PGA Tour on TV all the time and think, oh, well, those are the greatest golfers in the world, and those must be the greatest golf courses in the world. And so we all the profession slowly adapted away from the quirk of New England golf courses that are 5,800 yards long with rock outcroppings, and where people adapted the golf course to the site. At that certain point in the 40s and 50s, with the advent of heavy machinery, we all of a sudden decided that the better plan of attack was to adapt the site to our golf courses. We wanted to put our own ideas on the golf courses. And that's where I think golf architecture went terribly south for the longest time, for 30 or 40 years. So that's the irony of landscape architects being involved in golf course architecture at that point.
yeah. And I think for me, when you think of Olmsted and his principles, and I think it's wonderful. There's this wonderful body of work, and me as a student still of the game and of landscape architecture, I look at these principles and their tendencies, and so I'm a bit of a maverick, and so now I'm going to break that rule. And now for me, that's how you unlock either the genius of the site or you unlock the solution for this, is that you look at everything that's been done and it's like, man, this just isn't working. I've got to break this rule. And then voila, now everything else opens up. And so it can be different. And I think my work at the First Tee was interesting. 1999, and people were not rushing to go play little short courses or something that was 6 holes or reversible, and how quick the industry, now how quick the industry has latched on to something like that. We got shut down for a lot of very fun alternate solutions that would have been great. And now everyone wants their little short course or do something different. But to me, it was just going back of, I was on the golf course and it was empty, and there was nothing to do, and we would play cross country, we would reverse it, we would do all these different things. So me as a designer, that's how I would reconcile these constraints. It's just go in the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, it's been interesting that the contrary effect of COVID on golf, I mean, it was totally unexpected. We're an industry that for almost 20 years had been going down, fewer players, fewer courses. Suddenly COVID, people rediscover these basic things about golf. It's healthy, it's fun to be with your friends, it's good for you to be with your friends, it's good for you to be outside getting some exercise. And then that, bringing all these new people in, and suddenly, as you say, now short courses are popular, places where multi-generational groups can play and not have to worry about trying to, subdue the course, but just enjoy it. So I'm just curious how all of you have taken on the different challenges in the COVID and post-COVID era compared to what you were doing before.
I'll start. What I saw actually started probably in 2014, 2015, where people who hadn't done any work, remember, a lot of things happened in the past 20 years. Think about the year 2000, the dot-com bust. What happened the year after that? 9/11. 2006, you started seeing the decline of this mortgage crisis started happening that culminated in 2008. And people didn't recover from that until several years after. So by the time 2013, 2014 came around, people were ready to do things who were at clubs. Remember, the golf courses you're looking at, many people talk about today, are at least 20 years old, because there was very little work done between the year 2000 and 2015, 2016. New construction. And it's only this past year we heard, 12 new courses? So prior to that, there might have been 6, 3, 2, very few courses in that span of 20 years. That's a complete generation's difference in mindset, a generation's difference in technology, both in construction, in how we live, in how we communicate. Anybody here know when the first iPhone came out and how that changed everybody's lives? It's been 12 years ago, right? So it's not been that long ago. So when you think about when I think about COVID, what I think most about are the clients I had who chose to do work in 2015, 2016, and 17. And among the things that we were doing were the things that Brandon talked about, adding short courses, par 3 courses, short game areas, additional areas to practice. All of those people were already prepared, they didn't know it, to be able to handle all the new golfers that arrived when golf was deemed a safe sport in which to participate, so that you could have fresh air, exercise, social advantages. And so from my perspective, it started before COVID. The people who were ready to do something different after all these financial issues.
I mean, COVID for me, really, the only thing that's changed for me COVID-wise is everything costs 25 to 30% more in construction now. We didn't really slow down in COVID. So I can't really say, a boring answer, but I can't really say that things have changed much. I do love the innovation of the short course idea and all of that. I think that's the one difference now than the last short course invasion we had, which was before at least my career, in the 70s, 60s and 70s, short courses were sort of a concept that was gaining traction but didn't last very long. And so I think mostly because the design, like many of the courses in the 60s and 70s, the design of those short courses wasn't very inspiring. Now we have short courses that are, again, going back to the genius of the place, have something special to offer and more interest and challenge. So I hope that the short course concept, not necessarily continues, but maintains its status quo. And 10 years from now, all these short courses that are around are as active then as they are now. I just worry a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, like Richard, we haven't changed our operation to actually go and do your work because golf courses are jam-packed. So if I want to go and study a golf course, whereas you could go out there at a time when no one was on the golf course, and now you're wading through 2 or 3 different groups, on a whole. For me, it's good to see people out and enjoying the game and playing a lot of golf. And I think people working from home, people in control of their own time now, you're seeing golf courses full from sunup to sundown. We were doing work at one of our courses, and I could see kind of the wave of people coming out of their house at about 3 or 4 o'clock. And I can only imagine, I would see them at 7 a.m., typing away, doing their work, and then 3 o'clock, it's like, I got to get out of here, and they go play 9 holes or go play 18 holes. So that's what I'm seeing, and that's been a big catalyst to this boom.
Could I ask a question that's kind of related to what you were saying? Has the modern equipment played a role in the way that you design courses? I mean, you have DeChambeau hitting it 380 yards. So has that played a role in how you look at designing courses today as opposed to what it would have been like in, back in Bobby Jones' day? Who played here, by the way, when he was at Harvard.
Well, I think that anybody who has the desire to host a championship, that's meaningful. And I think most courses, most facilities, operators don't have those aspirations. And of course, if you look at the majors, many of the majors are already slotted for the next 30 years at least. So, but anybody who wants to host another event, then they would have to look at lengthening a golf course. But I was on the USGA distance study group, and they found that people, yes, they're hitting the ball somewhat farther, but for most of us, not that much. I mean, Bryson DeChambeau and John Daly in his day and Jack Nicklaus in his day certainly were the longest hitters. And think about what happened, when Tiger Woods played Augusta. He wanted tiger-proof. He wanted to protect against distance. But not every course needed to do that. I've worked on some courses when I worked with Tom Fazio where the Honda Classic was going to be held. And we had a 656-yard par 5 that no one plays at 650 yards today. So I think that in reality, we probably design more for the wayward shot, but with the improved balls, if you're playing the right golf ball, then you're not as wayward as you might have been with a Bellata and a Persimmon.
We see it in practice facilities. That's where a lot of the troubles are occurring. You go into golf courses and facilities which are much older right now, and now you get the young kids who can hit it just as far, as the tour pros, and we get golf facilities that we've had designed where you end up having 2 tees on either end of the practice range. Even 20 years ago, now they're having to go back in and spend money to remodel it to make it longer. And so we are seeing that, across the board. There's one big area.
So Jason, I was playing a course you designed in Florida, Calusa Pines in Naples, and I was putting, and I heard a ball go over my head and hit the trees behind me. And it was a 340-yard, so it's short, par 4. And there was a pro who I saw was recently named Brandon Matthews, who was practicing there from the back tee, and he had hit it like 380 by accident. He wasn't trying to. And he was so apologetic when he came up, but it's that's a different kind of problem than, say, Tillinghast would have faced.
Yeah, but see, you say that, but everything old is new again. So I could go back in and I could probably pull it up on my phone. I have a golf cartoon, right? And there were these 2 gentlemen, they were in these little single rider golf carts, and they had a big telescope gun in it, and their sign, and it said par 3, 1 mile, 273 yards. And the guy says, did you hit yours well, old chap? And he says, I think I cut it a bit, but I still think I reached the green. And then you look at the date on the cartoon, and it was 1912. So, I mean, it's not, you know, it's just we keep perpetuating things is what happens. Now, I will say a big part is in the maintenance equipment. Now, the maintenance equipment has had a profound impact on the game and on the sport. You know, I mean, you go out to old golf courses, and you know, you had slopes and greens because the grass would be, you know, mowed at 1/4 inch. You know, now it's mowed at 1/10 of an inch or less, and you know, that's had a profound impact.
And I'll answer it a little bit different, not so much the clubs and the balls, but you know, on the professional level, if you think about a tournament, what the PGA Tour has done with data and the collection of where every golf pro hits every golf shot through, you know, the course of a tournament and then through the course of a whole year on tour, and then you start to build that data over years and years and years. And it blows up the myth, I think, of how we thought golf courses would play angles or this and that. And you know, it allows us, I think, to look at a golf course a bit different, but I think it also allows the player to understand how they are playing a golf course different. And I think that also translates to how a player is going to practice. And they know how far the golf ball is going to go. They know how far the golf ball is going to go, 65 degrees versus 80 degrees versus 95 degrees. Whereas before, it was a lot of guesswork. But you see them on the range now, you know, 6 degrees in the morning, it's going to warm up, it's going to be 80, and they know how to adjust for that. And before it was all by feel. So it just dials them in, you know, that much closer. They know how much a putt is going to break if the green is rolling at 11.5 on the stem, whereas people didn't know that before.
So how do you think Olmsted would have changed his design if he had all these modern tools that we have now?
That's interesting. I do think he'd have a healthy critique on our profession, though, through the dark ages, if you will, with the boom in real estate. I mean, I think there was a better way of doing that, but yeah, it'd be interesting. I think he'd move a lot of dirt.
I think what I was really impacted by today was at how much technology that he actually utilized, you know, within his practice. I mean, I mean, if I bring my son there, he would say, "Dad, this is archaic." You know, I look at it and go, "Geez, I was right on the fringe of using a lot of this stuff." So,
Exactly. I mean, I think they would have been very happy using anything that was available to them now, had it been available to them. I mean, you know, Olmsted used, just under 5,000 people in building Central Park, because he didn't have heavy equipment, and, you know, he didn't have the resources to do the kind of stuff if it were being built today. So anyway, I think, Michael, are you ready to sum up?
Hi everybody. I was asked, I also wanted to be a golf course architect, but I did not make it through landscape architecture school as tenaciously as they did. I became a golf course superintendent and was a superintendent of many golf courses in Massachusetts. But now I work for the National Park Service, and I work for the aptly named Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation, which we go around, we're a regional program, regional center, to help some of our small historic sites. So you might notice that we don't have the Yosemites and the Yellowstones. We have smaller sites like the Fairsted site or Adams. We have these smaller historic sites. Complicated landscapes, not always having like the expertise available there. So we're a support center for that. We're a support center to help. We do cultural landscape reports, which is the equivalent of master planning that you guys all kind of respond to when you work with clubs. We do cultural landscape reports and cultural landscape inventories for these important landscapes. So they asked me to come here to kind of like draw this together and talk about the stewardship of these properties afterwards, and the importance of the stewardship. And I'm glad the conversation kind of went where it went, because we started talking about, like, you know, if you've been in this business long enough, the success of your design really kind of hinges on how it's cared for. I'm thinking in terms of, we talked a little bit about maintenance. You know, if you design a golf course to play firm and fast, a lot of ground contours, a lot of ground features that you want to be taking advantage of, and the desire of many memberships and many golfers is for verdant and green, and all of a sudden kind of take away that ball bounce. On the other hand, if you're designing a posh country club with, you know, for the aerial game, and someone comes in and like tries to kind of, you know, hold back on the fertilizers, hold back on the water, mow it short, get it fast, also renders the design not as functional as you guys had all wished. When it comes to Olmsted, it's a little bit more, it's like trying to pick up, he was so hands-off. Like we talked a little bit about the genius of the place. Sorry, he wasn't hands-off. His design looked like they're hands-off. They're very natural looking. You can't believe, if you went to Central Park, you wouldn't believe the amount of engineering that went into that, because it does. It looks so natural. And what we find ourselves when we're maintaining his landscapes or other landscapes is really trying to not overdo it. Like, if we were at Fairsted and all of a sudden you started seeing Disney-style beds of annuals kind of ringing the house, if you started seeing topiaries, Alan used the idea of a garden gnome. If you put a garden gnome over there, it's all of a sudden you're taking away from, you're making a place busy. You're taking away from his vision of not busying the eye so much. There's a quote along those lines. I can't remember, but it was the idea of you wanted to rest your eyes. It was a very pastoral look. And so it does take this type of knowledge as stewards to really bring and continue to bring his designs to life. Something else that disappears if you're not paying attention to it, a landscape wants to just take over. It is not like preserving a statue, which work goes into that, but nature's always trying to thwart you. It's like it's trying to grow more stuff. It's trying to get bigger. It's trying to remove your view sheds. It's trying to crowd out each other. There's all these things that are kind of going on. So it ends up being a really delicate balance when it comes to some of these landscapes. So I don't know whether I'm allowed to end a little bit, but ask the panelists to kind of talk about the stewardship of their designs a little bit and what that means to them. If we have time to do that.
Sure. No, it's a wonderful question because a golf course is a living thing, as is a Olmsted Park. So it's something that has to be addressed more or less constantly. So, Jason.
That's a great question, and I don't know that we always have control over it, unfortunately. You'd like to see your work perpetuated. We've got some wonderful clients. First off, I guess we're all getting to the point where, as my daughter says, Dad, you're just getting old. And so it's kind of interesting to go back to designs that you worked on 20 and 30 years ago and have clients come to you and say, what are the founders of the club or the people that you were involved with are now passing on, they're moving on, but we want to make sure that the vision of your firm is archived, is understood for that next generation. It's nice to be able to have somebody ask you to do that. So we are, even matter of fact, we've worked in Westerly, Rhode Island and up in Ipswich here, and both clubs have asked us to start to archive and put that vision down so that it can get passed along. That's not always the case, though. I was with another client, and we were working, and the superintendent the other day just said, he goes, I said, do you think that this is okay? And he looked at it, and he goes, don't worry about it. He goes, we'll change it next time we rebuild. And I went, wait a minute. What do you mean? This should be it. There's no next time, So it all depends on the client.
Well, a lot of my work is restoration work. Restoration of Ross courses in Tillinghast and Thompson and Mandell. And so we have to, a lot of times we come in on the back end of a project or of a membership that didn't really take care of their site. And so we have to try to restore that while also dealing with technology. So where someone like Ross might have put bunkers 225 yards off the back tees in the fairway, those bunkers don't come into play as much. So we have to preserve that, but also update technology as well. So that is a challenge for us from a preservation standpoint as well. But what's interesting is the more you learn about Olmsted, is he definitely had that same issue. He had those same frustrations that all of us had. The numerous times that he was fired or let go at Central Park alone, or where he didn't see the University of Berkeley, his campus plan for Berkeley ever come to fruition, all of that. We come through and deal with that all the time. So going back to Jason saying, we don't necessarily have control over that. That's a big challenge of of our profession. So,
Actually took my anxiety level down today when I saw some of that there out at the Fairsted, because I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one. Even Frederick Olmsted had these issues.
right.
Right? I mean,
Alan, didn't wasn't like in his final years up at Belmont Hospital, like he was looking out the, there's a campus he designed, and it infuriated him that they didn't take care of it or implement it the way that he wanted to. He
And
was
that
stuck
wasn't
there.
unusual either, that they, against Stanford University, right in the middle of the project, Mrs. Leland Stanford decided that her brother-in-law could carry out the design just as well as the Olmsted firm could. They actually dropped the project of Balboa Park in San Diego because they wanted to place like a railroad station right in the middle of a big field, which was like key to their design. So yeah,
that was the gnome, wasn't it?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's what sometimes I'll try to explain to people that Olmsted didn't design by fiat. He had to take, and like you folks, I mean, when he designed Central Park, it had to have carriage roads, it had to have music. He wasn't making those decisions. He got a list of what had to be there, and his genius was able to put it into that design, but still keep the whole feeling of being in this surrounded by nature. But Central Park is actually a bad example than Olmsted Park. It's way more high Victorian. Franklin Park is almost really what you're looking for in Olmsted's mind.
That's the evolution of Olmsted.
Yeah, it really is. It is. I mean, the Roxbury pudding stone you picked out over there, it's made, all the building materials that he used here was basically Roxbury pudding stone, because as he said, the less things seem dressed up by human hands, the better. And one of the ways you did that was by using material that was at hand that you'd see anyways out the window.
It also gives you a sense of place. We talk about genius of place, but
Yep.
that sense of place, you want to be able to feel like, you don't want to feel like you're in Franklin Park with palm trees and white sands. That's not, that New England feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's been said a lot. I mean, we're not in control. Nature doesn't allow us to be in control, and then, human intervention or non-intervention doesn't allow us to be in control. And certainly with our firm, with, our founder having passed, and he, selected myself and Thad to kind of carry on this legacy, and he was also a tinkerer too. So it's not like he played a golf round with the same putter or driver. I mean, he wanted to also push the envelope. So we are indebted to all the superintendents that are working on our projects, because anything that we propose needs to be able to be maintained and then kind of morph and evolve with what nature is going to do. And if you've got a grass like Bermuda that's growing together, I mean, you can't hold it back. But at the same time, this push to continue to move forward. I mean, me as a designer, I love history, and I think one of the things that Harvard taught me was, this idea that you have these, historical buildings or whatever, and you've got to move beyond that. We as landscape architects, we have to move beyond Olmsted. We have to learn from those principles and improve upon it. So I mean, we look at our work kind of the same way, is that there are some great things that have happened. And if, the golf course is 50 years old, and like you said, the membership has changed, the industry has changed, the ball has changed. Now technology, we actually have, and this, we talked about archive, the ability to GPS, a green or a feature down to 3 millimeters, whereas a lot of this restoration work that happens now, I mean, you're interpolating old plans and drawings and pictures, and there's a lot of, I don't want to say there's a choice that the designer is making in there. Well, we now have the ability to have this exact kind of GPS data and replica of what is there. So if you do make a change, hey, we went from this to this. Or no, 50 years from now, we want it exactly like this. And I think it's the first time in golf architecture history where we've been able to do that.
We've actually taken GPS into the field. So you can imagine some of our landscapes can be pretty complicated. One that comes to mind is that we did a prototype on was the Eisenhower Historic Site, and really complicated, very heavily planted site. And you'd walk onto that place and it'd be, oh, this is beautiful. It's a lovely place. What we did is we took cultural landscape inventory, which we're government. Of course, we got to inventory things and know what we have, and we have a period plan. We use GPS, a tablet, to be able to go on, and you would say, oh wow, that plant's not supposed to be there. Oh, this plant's missing. Like it really was a really great tool that we're just starting to use on the maintenance side of things to be able to make some decisions. You might be making Herculean efforts to try to keep a tree alive that Ike and Mimi did not plant. And is supposed to be removed anyway. So having like that real field GIS information is going to be really useful in the future, I think, and probably for all you all to be able to maintain your lines and maintain your features as well.
When we're also, the technology and restoration, same thing. We're able to overlay aerial photography, for decades of aerial photography on top of our base map. And we can be somewhat successful if we have plans, like the plan of Yeaman's Hall, or we have a lot of Ross plans. The challenge there is that those plans get stretched over time as they run through blueprint machines. So there's an art there. You're talking about the art and decisions we need to make about trying to move that around. But the aerial photography and the ability to overlay all that in AutoCAD really allows us to get restoration closer than we've ever gotten. Of course, we still have to make decisions based on technology.
So
Go ahead, sorry, Dan.
because I grew up working on a golf course at a young age, I have a real sense of what it takes to keep something. Just last year, I went back to the golf course my dad designed, and I could see all the landforms were just as he had placed them. And he did, never having studied Frederick Olmsted, he tied all the contours into grade out here somewhere so that everything looked believable. It looked like you found the green. It looked like you found the tees. They didn't look like they were created. But beyond that, in the intervening years, people planted trees that didn't belong where they are. And they had a terrific impact on what happened after the trees were installed. Somebody moved dirt. Now you're changing the contours outside. You're changing drainage. So what we don't know, even though we might have a master plan and we might say this is what we did and this is why we did it, it doesn't prohibit, unless the club takes advantage of saying that no changes will be made to this master plan unless that somebody else's thumbprint is going to come on that golf course. So those are the things against which we can't really guard. And it really has to be a club philosophy, owner philosophy, developer philosophy. Whomever's in charge of the golf course is, if we're going to make changes, it's not indiscriminately by one of the playing golf course architects who happens to be there every day or every week. It's by someone whose profession it is, someone who has an expertise, whether it's the person who did the design work, or someone like Rich who goes back and does restoration. So I think it's the maintenance depends on the budget. You fall on hard times. People move out of a county, move out of a city, and all of a sudden the population isn't what it was when you first did the golf course. Those things happen. And or all of a sudden there's more people there and the course can't handle because there's more play than originally intended. Or there's younger players than had been there 25 years ago. And so now you end up with the issues that Jason's talking about, where they're hitting it too far and there are danger issues. So we count on the golf course superintendents, just as whether it's a Frederick Olmsted property or it's a Frank Lloyd Wright house, if you don't have the maintenance to keep it the way it was intended, it's not going to look that way in 3 years, 5 years, 20 years, 50 years. And I think that's part of what you have been doing, is you're now trying to catch up with some of the things that maybe weren't pursued as they could have been. And just so I'm not pointing fingers, I think we all do this at our own houses. You know, we do a little deferred maintenance, right? So I think that's some of it as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we're closing to the end of our time here. I want to thank you all for coming. And I also want to just say how much personally I enjoyed working with the National Park Service staff and planning of this event. And I want to just make sure that you're all aware of what incredible work they do in providing these facilities for all of us to come and visit and see and work in. And I think it was a real eye-opener for all the golf course architects to see what's in that Frederick Olmsted National Historic Site, the resources that are there, the drawings, the plans, really inspiring. And I think we'll all be studying them quite a bit in the future. So we're going to hang around a little bit if any of you have any questions for us after this sort of formal event ends. But I want to thank you all and thank all my colleagues and friends for being here today, and I hope you enjoyed it.